Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. It's once again a pleasure to join you to hear a story tonight. Our guest, John Lillyman. You'll tell by his accent that even though he comes to us from Nebraska, he came from somewhere else before then, almost the exact other side of the world, down in Australia. So
Right.
He's a former Anglican and Presbyterian. And John, welcome to The Journey Home.
Thanks, Marcus.
It's great to have you here.
It's a great privilege to be here, and I have to say that in my journey into the Catholic Church that I watched many episodes of The Journey Home. I took great consolation and great encouragement, and many of my questions were surfaced and were answered by the responses of those that you interviewed. So it was a great blessing, and it's probably how I got in touch with the resources that are available on EWTN as well, the library and the videos and all sorts of other resources
that
are available there.
The program accomplished its task.
Yes, it was terrific.
Mother, God bless her, one of her reasons for the program was because so many Catholics would write her bemoaning the fact that their children and siblings had left the church. And so her goal was, boy, if they can hear a convert tell a story, then it might give people hope. Boy, if he can come into the church, then maybe my son can come back. But we also try and reach out to those that have no affiliation with the Catholic Church to hear the arguments and the answers. So God bless.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Let me get out of the way and invite you to take us on the journey then.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, I would probably want to start with a little bit of background as well, just to explain.
Way back when, right.
I'm married. I've been married for 33 years to my beautiful bride, Rebecca, and we have 7 children. And you're right, we live in Kearney, Nebraska. But as you have pointed out, my accent betrays the fact that I'm not a Native American. I'm not originally from this land. In fact, as an Aussie, I never expected to be living in the United States. Very, very unexpected. Perhaps similarly, I never expected to be part of the Catholic Church. So the Lord is full of surprises, and that's what I've learned in my journey.
When I grew up, I always thought that when Australians visited the United States, they had to work real hard to stand upright. To keep their feet on the ground because they're so used to standing on the other side of the earth.
Oh, sure, upside down, Well, actually, your map is probably oriented the wrong way.
Right.
We put Australia on the top. But no, I grew up in a stable, loving home in Australia. My parents were not Christians. We weren't church-going folk. Like many Australians, life is pretty good. You've got money in your back pocket. Who needs God? I mean, life is pretty good in Australia.
Does that have a lot to do with the way Australia was founded, the kind of people there, in terms of even a resistance to religious folk being invited in, priests especially?
No, actually, some of the secular history would say that wasn't present, but it really was. There was great vision from the Anglican Church, from the Church of England, to do new things in Australia that would bring spiritual vitality. But that's not always elevated in histories you read on the Australian past. But there certainly was, religious connections in my family history and my relatives, but there wasn't that living faith. I didn't grow up with a real sense of understanding the Christian religion. I certainly had a sense that there must be a God. I grew up on a bushland, on the edge of a sort of bushland reserve in suburban Sydney. And my dad was an architect. I grew up in a modernist home. My dad built a glass box on the side of a bushland reserve. So I grew up as sort of a child of a modernism, but I grew up with a real sense that there had to be a creator. I mean, just looking at the bushland around me and nature convinced me that there must be a God. But that's about all. I think maybe the thread through my life that I'd want to elevate and point to was, I recall as a child that on my door of my bedroom, someone had bought a ceramic tile. They had a picture of a little child kneeling by his bed with the word, "John, God is gracious." And, if I look back on my life, that would be probably the thing I'd want to elevate, is the graciousness of God. I really have experienced the kindness and goodness of God through my life. And I think as my testimony or on my tombstone would be the same thing. God has been so gracious to me. But for those early years, there wasn't much happening spiritually. My neighbor took me to a Methodist Sunday school for a year, and I still have the little book I was given at the end of that year on the life of St. Paul. But Not a lot happening. Like many Aussies, there was no Christian that visited and tried to explain the gospel to me. I didn't really have any friends that I would say were church-going and strong Christians, so you just kind of wander through life.
And the schools, as keeping religion aside, as in the States here too, in terms of your public schooling and such?
No. Actually, in Australia, it's unusual that they do have the people come in from the community to teach religion, to teach. So that is still being done, which is kind of unusual in more of a secular country to see that opportunity. That may close, that door may close, but so maybe I heard something there, but I don't recall much. Yeah. Well, I guess the next sort of milestone for me perhaps was sort of a midlife crisis at the age of 10 when I sought to enter. My parents had entered me to attend a private boys' school, and there was an entrance exam involved in that. And I didn't do terribly well. My father was really disappointed. In fact, they said, well, we'll let him into 5th grade, but we're not sure if he'll make it to high school. And so suddenly I felt, oh my goodness, I'm a complete failure. So that was a point in which I remember beginning to pray. And I prayed every night from that point on. But it was somewhat superstitious, it wasn't really a living faith at all, but it was just more like, I hope nothing bad happens to me, and pray to this God that everything will go well. So I didn't walk on the cracks, and it was very much.
If you miss that prayer, oh no!
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it was very much kind of a ritualistic, superstitious function, but prayer entered in at that point, and prayer has certainly been another mark. That little boy praying by his bed, prayer has been a very strong part of my spiritual journey on into Christianity and onward from there.
So this lack of faith, God is there, but who is he or what's he like or anything? There's just no data, right? Is that how you look back on it? How long did that last then?
Well, I think it probably lasted up into my university years. The next major milestone was really during my architectural studies.
Following your dad's footprints then. Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah, I found that architecture was something that when I looked at the curriculum, I thought, well, we do a bit of everything. That looks great. Let's go for that. And it came somewhat naturally, so I enjoyed architecture. But like many young people, I was searching for deeper truth and deeper. I was looking for leadership really too. Who could I follow? Is there leadership out there? A lot of the tough guys were strong leaders, but they seemed to sort of walk all over people. And then there were the weaker guys that seemed to be nice guys, but they got walked over. So I was hunting for something to invest my life into. And but I had a theory of architecture class at the university that opened up really faith questions and issues. And I felt quite embarrassed that I hoped I wasn't asked any biblical questions, because I had no idea how many disciples there were or who Christ's parents were. But it got me inquisitive, and the assignments pushed me to look at medieval architecture and the genius of the medieval mind, and medieval architects were God-centered. So that opened a door that got me going, and I think I pulled an old King James version of the Bible off the shelf in our home that I don't think had ever been cracked. I think it was given to my parents at their wedding, and I began to read through that and investigate on my own. So that's what I would say when things began to open up.
Was that time period when they were seeing numbers and shapes and all of this to have spiritual meanings?
Absolutely.
So that's what they were doing, and so even the design of a building, every shape and everything had some spiritual message or connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's something we've lost in architecture, but I think we're starting to regain a sense in which we want to be in tune with the harmony of the universe. That they understood that the universe had built-in patterns and rhythms and proportions, that if we mimic them in our buildings, we were in tune with the beauty and harmony of this God-centered universe.
Yeah, that's why it's beautiful, because it has this simplicity that fits a pattern that has a bigger pattern than just my own preference of what I like in that thing.
Yeah, we're very much, at least my education, architectural education, was very much in the line of the sons and daughters of the Enlightenment, which is the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's a subjective thing. You get out of the way of the genius because he's, in a class of his own, the Frank Lloyd Wrights, etc. You can't criticize them. But traditionally, what I began to realize was there's a whole different kind of wisdom prior to this current age of modernism that spoke of reflecting the built-in harmony that God has built in. So that really fascinated me. And so that was, I think like many of us, there were many influences. There was a sense in which morally I didn't feel like I was in the right place, even in my own family upbringing. But there was also these questions about leadership and who could I ever follow, and then there were questions about beauty and architecture. So God was bringing me compelling evidence on many fronts, as I think he does. He seems to address us in many different ways.
Our guest is John Lillyman. One other question about that class, which fascinates me a little bit, was the professor teaching this time period and what they believed positively or flippantly?
No.
You know what I'm saying? As if he was a modernist looking back?
Yeah. No, he was teaching it. It was almost like a guru. I mean, he was a fascinating guy.
All right.
He was almost a mystic. I think he was Catholic, but I think he was. I'm not quite sure because we studied Eastern religion and the Western religions, but I think deep down he was wanting us to see the genius of Catholicism. But it was a good for me because I wanted to understand what is the Eastern mindset. How does the Eastern mindset resolve the difficulty of unity and diversity, or the one and the many, and seeing that that's resolved in the very Godhead of Christianity was really compelling evidence. It made me think, wow, there is truth and there is some wisdom in these other religions and these other civilizations that have grappled with these great problems, but it seemed like Christianity was the icing on the cake. It really resolved so much that I had questioned, and it was, and I guess with my own upbringing, more of a Western upbringing, I was perhaps more attracted to these Christian roots. And that's where, at that point, another book I pulled off the shelf in our library at home was John Stott's Basic Christianity.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And funnily enough...
I haven't seen that in a long time.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? Yes. We had a nurse come into the home when my youngest sister was born, and she obviously was a dedicated Christian, and she gave that to my parents and said, you might like to read this. And so it got put on the shelf, but I picked it off. And now that book really knitted everything together. Because just reading the Bible on its own, I couldn't make head or tail of man's condition and how that's rectified. I saw truth here, and the words of Christ were very appealing and rang true, but I couldn't understand what is salvation and how do we achieve heaven, all those sorts of things. So Stott answered all that, and he also provided the prayer to pray. And so back in October of 1980, I knelt by my bed and prayed that prayer and gave my life over to Christ.
Again, grace.
Grace, yeah.
Dropping a book into your hands.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, wonderful.
Had you been to an Anglican church at this point? Or?
A little bit, yeah. I'd sort of dropped in sort of very much.
But the point is you found Christ through the reading of this book primarily, apart from church.
Right,
yeah.
right. No, there was no evangelist. As I looked at all my friends at that time, maybe 100 buddies, maybe one that was a Christian, but he wasn't really even church going. But see, this is the state of the nation, unfortunately, in Australia back in those days. It may be a little bit different today, but not a whole lot different. So, but I was convicted, and so I found a church and started attending an Anglican church, and a wonderful rector there, and great youth group, even though I felt like I was king of the kids. I was about the oldest kid there in my mid-20s, but I just wanted to grow. I wanted to learn. I was convicted that Christ was who he claimed to be, and I wanted to follow him. And unfortunately, like these decisions often are, that alienated a lot of people. A lot of my friends that were interested in spirituality, once I brought up Jesus Christ, it was like, we don't want to talk about this anymore. You could talk about God all day long, but it opened up doors to new friendships, and friendships that have lasted for a lifetime, and some wonderful examples of what it means to be truly Christian. And so the Bible, evangelism, prayer, church became pillars of what I understood the Christian faith was resting on as far as living that life as a disciple. So really good stuff.
Holiness?
Holiness, yeah, the quest for holiness.
I was going to say, because sometimes that particular brand of evangelicalism doesn't emphasize that as much as it emphasizes evangelization.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think it was there. I think that piece came a little later on as far as a quest and a goal, as being an ultimate goal. But I think the quest to be sold out for Christ, that this was everything to me, was definitely embedded. And in fact, a lot of people, I think, expected, well, John's got religion, I guess he'll be a pastor, or a priest. But the counsel I received at the time was, God has converted you in very much the last weeks of your architectural course. Stay the course. Don't move too quickly. The advice was, stay in architecture. As much as you may feel that, my goodness, everything else is, sort of like rubbish compared to this. This is so good. I just want to be whatever it means to go full out for Christ. But I wasn't long in Australia, and this is where the Nebraskan piece comes in that my dad had worked in London, and it was often a goal of a newly graduating architect to do the European tour. And so that's shortly after being baptized and confirmed, I left Australia. So I was only really a disciple for a short time, but then headed off to Europe to backpack through Europe for about a year, and I had a job lined up at the end. But during that time, I'd been recommended, if you need a time to be with other Christians, I'd recommend you might check out L'Abri. There it is.
I was wondering about Wait, I bet you. Yeah.
So during my travels, I went to English L'Abri a number of times and absolutely loved it. Fell in love with the teaching, and it broadened my base because I began to understand my love for the arts, for fine art and architecture, how that would be all within this huge Christian worldview. And I really enjoyed Schaeffer's sort of dissection of where we're at and where we've been, and Hans Ruckmacher, the modern art and the death of a culture. I just thought, this is great. This is really explaining a lot for me. So I plugged back in a number of times, and on my final time, my wife-to-be arrived on the same day that I arrived, and we were engaged 3 weeks later.
Wow, that's quick.
So it was really a fairy tale. It was very much some enchanted evening.
Because you were also on the same page spiritually at L'Abri in that sense?
Well, in God's grace. I mean, it could have been, you're right. I mean, two people coming from different parts of the world. I mean, we could have been very different, but we were very much like brother and sister in our love for Christ and a lot of our common values and goals in life. So I realize now that was somewhat naive. I think Rebecca's parents were in tears. They're like, who is this guy? Does he have a last name? And they realized that, okay, he's from Australia, he is a Christian, but do you know him? And what's his family background? But I think that was the reason why after 3 weeks we thought, we really enjoy being together and working together at L'Abri and talking together. Where do you go from? Well, maybe we get engaged. You know what I mean? It was, and we'd never held hands or kissed or anything, but we just felt like, here I am from another part of the world, and here you are, and I could leave and go back to Australia, you could go back to the States, we could correspond, but it probably wouldn't go anywhere. But
I was just thinking, just to pause there, there's probably a lot of folk out there that haven't a clue what L'Abri is, or what Francis Schaeffer is, and how he founded that particular retreat center and centers as a place for evangelical-minded folk, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, some people would say it's a commune, and Schaeffer would correct and say, no, we're a community here, and but people were encouraged to come for a week or more, not for there wasn't a drop-in center as such, but come and really do some studious work and work in the fields and study, sort of a monastic model. Though I wouldn't have thought of it back then, but I realize now there's somewhat of a monastic model of working and serving and studying and reading. And there were group times in the evening, and some of the best discussions were across the dinner table with the families that you would eat with in the evening. So
it almost reminds me of a Madonna house in Canada, that kind of an environment where you come to live and you work and you study and you pray together. I mean, it's very similar.
And you have time to digest the information that you're being fed and come back with tough questions. And Schaeffer would always say, honest answers to honest questions. So there was never any fear that you were asking a question that was taboo. Or so that was a great, and that model is something that we wanted to live out in our life back in America, in the States.
All right.
Yeah.
So you and your wife are engaged at L'Abri. Did you stay in that part of the world? What's the next step then?
Well, the next step was, I think you better meet my family. So I sort of pulled together all my last resources financially. We bought 2 tickets down to Australia. And Rebecca, we had sort of an engagement party down there, and Rebecca got to meet family and friends. And then very shortly after that, we headed up to Wheaton, Illinois, where Rebecca had grown up. Her dad, professor at Wheaton College for 47 years. So
really?
I got to know Wheaton. I thought Wheaton was like everywhere in the States.
She had evangelical roots, that's
absolutely.
For sure. Wow.
Strong Christian upbringing and strong Christian heritage. So quite different to my family's background. And wonderful parents. So she'd grown up in a stable, loving home as well, but grown up within the Wheaton bubble, the New Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And of course, as I said, I thought all of America was like Wheaton, Illinois. And it was a little bit like being in the candy store for me as a Christian, because we had wonderful Christian resources and world speakers coming in. John Stott came in there, right. And all Os Guinness and all these fabulous evangelical leaders came in to speak. So it was a tremendous time for me to continue to grow.
All right.
Yeah.
So did you settle there then?
We did. We settled there. We thought, we'll be married here. We were married in an OPC church.
No, you were Anglican back in Australia. Right. So what happens here?
Well, the family was worshiping at a Presbyterian church, and that was a church where we were married. And in many ways, Presbyterianism, that form of Presbyterianism, is very much like the Anglican experience in Australia, because it's low church in that it's not formal and more like a Catholic or high church. So the diocese in Sydney is a very evangelical diocese and more of a low church experience. So Presbyterianism and Anglicanism, very similar in the form of liturgy and the love for evangelicalism. And
it's been many years since I've read Schaeffer and John Stott in that group, but I could see the similarities. InterVarsity, that whole move InterVarsity with John Stott and G.I. Packer and Schaeffer really would connect with the OPC understanding of Calvinism.
Oh yes, yes, right. Absolutely. Yeah, very strong sort of Calvinistic flavor. I don't think my mind was attuned so much to the theology at that time. As a new Christian, it was again more these basics of prayer and building stronger foundations in Bible reading and prayer and evangelism. Those were passions. But another book by John Stott was Christian Mission in the Modern World. And that book came across my path at that time. And that helped me understand the place of Christian service and evangelism as partners. Because there was a lot of debate on, do we do this piece of service, or do we do this piece of evangelism, or do we do this piece of service to do evangelism? Stott does a wonderful job of reconciling that, I think, and making us realize that both are partners, both God intended both to be done. So at that point we got involved in, as foster parents, we became licensed foster parents and opened our home up. So we had over about 25 foster kids living with us for the next 7 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So again, that
for a young
model,
couple, that's a big challenge.
As a newly married couple, it was probably fairly brave, fairly crazy, and I have to say, I'm no great. There were many times I had one foot out the door, and Rebecca and I'd be like, I don't know how long we can do this. We had teenage boys for a number of years, and then we were house parents at a home for unwed mothers. So we were very, Schaeffer. Another strong piece from our Schaeffer heritage was the whole right to life. Schaeffer was really, at that time, quite an outspoken evangelical on pro-life. And we fully embraced that. We felt this is absolutely right. And so an expression for us was having a home where women who found themselves pregnant and often kicked out by a boyfriend or parents could come and go through that pregnancy. So the organization we were with was a Christian organization, and So, as I said, we were house parents there for a women's shelter and a boys' home.
Yeah, I was also thinking some of the audience might wonder, what's the big battle between service and evangelization? I mean, what's the problem there? It comes from kind of a Calvinist background that sees the service more on the work side of things.
Right.
So really the emphasis is now we're about sharing the gospel.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. You know, it's, well, what about that? And then it's also a kind of a cynical look at those that only emphasize the social side of things without telling them about Jesus.
Right.
So there's this overemphasis on evangelization, which Schaeffer really says, no, they're both true.
Yes. Yeah. Stott and Schaeffer both would say that they're both incredibly important, and they both express the life of Christ. You know, we see Christ doing both, sometimes both in the very same opportunity, but sometimes one, sometimes the other. Yeah, so that made total sense to me. And again, I see the Lord slowly building these understandings of how to live out my faith. But all along, Marcus, you know, it's a love story. I want to know Christ. It has driven my life. You know, from the very beginning, I've had a burning passion to know Him and to know how can I go deeper in my walk. So I would investigate things like fasting, and I'd read the ancients, the saints of the old, and find out, did they fast, and what is fasting, you know, and is it important, and what is the role of the Holy Spirit, you know, and do I need to investigate this more, because I want to know Christ, and I want to make Him known. The urgency, it's like eternity has always been ringing in my ears, and I think growing up in Australia and realizing that so many folks were numb to the issue of eternity has kept me awake at night, you know, that I cannot keep this quiet. Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break now, but when we come back, before we move on, I want you to talk about what you just said in relationship to grace. Because that hunger is not something you created, right? It's a gift. I want to talk about the importance of that. We'll come back in just a moment with our guest, John Lillyman. See you in a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi. Our guest tonight is John Lillyman, and I paused him in the middle. You're married and architect at that time. Is that what you're doing?
Yes.
Although you're doing service.
Yep, but I'm practicing architecture as well. So very full life, children coming along and realizing that we can't do all this. So
you're getting your own kids too, along with the others that you're taking care of. Wow, what a challenge.
Yeah, we had our third, on the birth of our third child, we realized, I don't think we can continue this pace. And at that point, my dad, who's a practicing architect in Australia, said, you know, if you wanted to team up with me, it'd kind of be now or never. So we thought, you know, I think it's time for us to go back now. I mean, we've done 7 years here. We thought it'd be 1 or 2, but let's head down to Australia. So kind of heart-wrenching for Rebecca's parents, whom I love very much. But we've called to follow the Lord, and so we headed down to Australia for me to work with my dad. But things didn't go according to plan. And this is where it takes quite a different turn, in that I did work as an architect in Sydney for a short time. But
were you Presbyterian, were down there, or did you return to the Anglican?
Yeah, good question. We began to hunt for a church. We visited an Anglican church and a Baptist church, but it wasn't theologically driven. It was more driven by how do we relate to the man in the pulpit, and how do we relate to the feel that we have in the congregation. And so it was much more of a, you know, are these our people? Sort of thing. Okay. These are the people we want to be a part of.
And are they preaching the gospel as you understood it?
Yeah, and going dynamic.
Did you visit any Catholic churches?
Oh, no.
So, I mean, up until time in your life, there's no opening.
No. And you need to understand, too, that my sort of Anglican and British background, I mean, I was raised in a pretty conservative family, and raised in schools that would say that, you know, the worst rugby games were against Catholic schools. The most bloody ones, that there was still this inbred sort of Britishness that to be loyal as a son or a child of the Commonwealth is not to be Catholic. So there was this ingrained, the worst thing I could have done was married a Catholic, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sadly, I don't know if that was so vocally spoken, but there was an undercurrent of anti-Catholicism, which is inbred into the history of Great Britain, unfortunately.
And then to marry into Wheaton, it reinforced it, not with much angered hatred, but still an assumption that nothing Catholic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was nothing happening in the Catholic Church. Why would you want to? We need to evangelize these folks. There's a church that keeps their people in kindergarten. They don't even know their way around the Bible. So Catholic Church was not in the picture. And funny that you mentioned that, because in my year out as an architectural student, I'll just reel the clock back, I got a job with a Catholic church, a Catholic firm that built Catholic churches. And as a student, I was drawing up drawings for Catholic churches. I didn't have a clue. I had to ask, now what is this AMBO thing here? So God has a sense of humor. There are little pieces interwoven in there. The one CD or the one cassette I took to Europe after my conversion was a John Michael Talbot. I loved his music. Yeah. I don't think I realized he was Catholic. This is a crazy piece that, Thomas à Kempis, he's okay, and, St. Francis, they're all good guys, but wait a minute, I never processed that they were Catholic, and deeply Catholic. Right. St. Augustine, he's one of ours, isn't he? It's crazy. But no, we started attending a Church of Christ church. Sadly, Marcus, too, the OPC church we attended in Wheaton, the Church of Christ church we attended, all blew up. All came under conflict with differing perspectives on what the scriptures actually taught, and blew up. So many of the churches we attended ended up drifting, breaking apart into, and that, I guess, I began to realize that all is not hunky-dory in the Christian world, and I began to experience different denominations, different perspectives. At that time, John Wimber and the whole Holy Spirit wind was blowing in Australia, so we began to understand that it was more than Father, Son, and Holy Scripture. There was this Holy Spirit person that we needed to investigate. So a lot of investigation went on in the early 90s for us. But we also became attached to a large mission in Sydney, the Wesley Mission, and began to work in their social welfare arm. So I dropped the T-square, if you like, and began pushing more into our piece of helping in the social welfare. So that began 7 years of being associated with Wesley Mission. And
also with your dad's firm?
No. So my dad didn't have enough work for me. He came into sort of the quietest spell on record. So I went and hit the road, got a job. But then that really petered out. It really led to me saying, I think God may be calling us to go back into social welfare, to assist with what was primarily, previously an orphanage, was now a social welfare arm of this huge mission in Sydney, which was originally a Methodist Central Mission. It was part of the Uniting Church, but was a fairly conservative arm of the Uniting Church. So theologically it wasn't disturbing, but it led me back into social welfare and continuing to grow as a Christian, being heavily involved in ministry all the time. And that led also to me jumping to take in a Masters of Evangelism at Wheaton College. So I'm fasting forward pretty quickly, but continue to feel a call to, I want to go further. Is it pastoral ministry? Maybe it's not with my family size now. Maybe I need to just take a Masters of Evangelism and continue to assist in evangelistic efforts here in Sydney. So Wheaton came up and had all sorts of scholarships and availability to do that through the generosity of Wheaton College, and so I jumped in and did a master's and
brought your family back to...
Yeah, because we're back in Wheaton. Okay. Rebecca's parents are there, back at home. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. I loved to study. I loved the smell of books. So it was a brilliant time, but it was also an incredibly powerful time because God was moving on that campus in 1993 and 94, and it broke out as a revival in 1995. So I got to experience the build-up to a genuine spiritual awakening or revival at Wheaton College in 1995. I mean, when you have 1,500.
I didn't notice it because
Yes.
I'd already come into the Catholic Church, so I was oblivious.
Oh
to what
man,
going
it
on at
was
Wheaton,
it was
really.
unbelievable.
Wow.
As Dwayne Litfin, the president at the time, in March of 1995, said, when you've got 1,000 students who a week before had no care for their soul condition, that are suddenly more concerned about God's vision on their soul, then you've got some sort of movement of the Holy Spirit that cannot be explained by machinery, But I was privileged to be there during the prayer build-up, and I saw momentum. I saw God was on the move. There were people that were at that college that were like, if I don't find God, I'm out of here. They were desperate for God, desperate for reality in their faith. And again, I leaned into God with many others in prayer and read of the great spiritual revivals this country has experienced in England. And so it was a great time of education. And I also had a great knowledge, observation of the life of John Wesley and his impact on Anglicanism. And so that theology, the Arminian piece began to come in and make a lot of sense to me. So I've got this Calvinist piece and this, I don't know how to reconcile these great guys, and so, yeah, I travel on with this tension. I love the Martin Lloyd Joneses and the John Stotts, but I also love John Wesley and his band of guys, so I don't know how to reconcile it, but my thirsting for holiness. Wesley's great quest was scriptural holiness.
Well, it's the Wesleyan side that gives you a real deep motivation for the holiness, because I've got to work out my salvation with fear and trembling. There's a part of that, whereas the Calvinist side, you've got it.
Yeah.
There's a little bit too much of that can take away from a motivation to change your life. I mean, it's a caricature of it.
Right.
But putting them together, you've got the both and. You've got it totally by grace, but yet there's that mystery of my part of it too.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, Wesley held out the possibility of being perfected in love. Yeah. That this entire sanctification was something possible for average Christians, not just for the upper shelf guys that, the upper shelf Christians. So I was hungry. I mean, if there was more to knowing Christ and experiencing his love, I wanted it. So I was hungry for grace. And I think that's, again, probably another theme in my life is that I didn't want to get to the end of my life and the Lord just say, John, I wish you'd pushed in a little bit more. I had so much more I wanted to show you. So I wanted to make sure I hadn't missed anything. And I had great respect for John Wesley and Charles Wesley and what they achieved and their heart for Christ, that I had to take note. I had to listen and find out what made these guys tick, what changed for them. So that traveled with me.
So did you head back down the other side of the pond again?
Went back down. They asked me to take the role of a chaplain at Wesley Mission, and that gave me opportunity to become an itinerant preacher. Yeah. So I got to preach in many churches in New South Wales that were supporting our mission. So a wonderful opportunity to preach the gospel at a time when, unfortunately, the Uniting Church was beginning to embrace less conservative positions that were very disturbing for the rank and file out in the country districts. They couldn't work out why the church was headed in the direction it was, but I just wanted to love these folks and help them take the next step of faith towards Christ or in their life with Christ. But a great, wonderful opportunity, and I really appreciate those days with Wesley Mission.
Yeah, someday we'll look back, or maybe next generation too will look back and be able to answer why this certain brand of progressive liberalism infected all the churches around the world.
Right.
At this time, what was going
and
on?
I think that a lot of people say, well, they just weren't Bible based, but these folks were Bible carrying people. They loved their scriptures too. But I think perhaps in their desire to embrace the culture, embrace people, not to turn anybody away, they were moving away from the traditional values, that John Wesley and others would have held. John Wesley, the mission I worked for, its motto in the early days was a living Christ for a dying world. It colored everything they did. But, sadly, that passion for evangelism was being whittled down. Like, we don't want to enforce our values on others. We just need to love people. And you're right. Be tolerant. And so I thought perhaps then it was a matter that they just weren't interpreting the Bible, the scriptures properly. But that would change as I moved on too. I began to realize as we moved back to the States and went on with our journey, that there was more to my understanding what was going on in Christendom.
Let's take you there. Let's take you there.
Yeah, okay. Well, as my work as an itinerant, as a deputationist continued, my own pastor said, John, you're away from home regularly, you've got a large family. I'd really recommend that you might consider the pastoral ministry. You and your wife, I think this would be something that would fit well for you. And it gets you back home again. And I don't think it's good for you to be gone so much. So I thought, ooh, that sounds like a word from the Lord. So at that point I thought, well, maybe I need theological training. Where would I go? And along the short of it was, I had a wonderful professor at Wheaton College, Dr. Lyle Dorset, who had moved into the Anglican world and had started a breakaway Anglican church in Wheaton that was growing and thriving. And he said, come over. We'll ordain you here. You can go through the ordination process. We're attaching ourselves with a diocese in Africa, or we're not Episcopal, but we believe in this sort of Anglican expression. And come. So we thought maybe that's the answer. And it's not a huge concussion point. We're back in Wheaton, back with friends and family. We love Lyle and Mary and really respect them. So we headed back. But that turned out to be sort of a worker pastor model, and with a growing family, it seemed this is going to be really actually very tough for us to pull this off. And again, I just didn't feel, I felt like in some ways we were doing church in a test tube. It was like, is this kind of like extension of the classroom, or is this really a valid church? As much as I loved Lyle and saw many young people flocking to this form of worship, it just didn't seem fully real. It was like, it's kind of like we're playing Anglicanism. So I sort of pulled back from my ordination piece and just invested in my architecture and got attached with a church building company. And we just were heavily involved in ministry and continued to raise our children. And at that point, we had 6 children and were enjoying life and lived in Wheaton. But then my work as an architect began to diminish, and I realized I had to look for work, and that's where the Nebraska came. All right. Is that, long story short on that an opportunity arose in Nebraska with a church building company, and I wanted to stay in ministry-focused architecture. I wanted to be in church-related work, and so that, again, heartbreaking for Rebecca's family, but we decided to pick up and move to Nebraska and attach ourselves with a church building company there and get involved in church life.
All right. Are you Presbyterian at that point out in Nebraska?
Well, in Nebraska, again, hunting around for a church. Okay. We checked out the Evangelical Free Church that's finally settled in a Berean church, which was kind of a Nebraskan experiment, if you like, a homebred experiment, sort of a fundamentalist Bible church. Right. And I became an elder there.
To be fairly non-Catholic.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
About as non-Catholic.
Yeah. Again, not very aware of the Catholic community and what's going on, but I'm out.
How did that start then, the Catholic thought?
Well, again, with that passion for evangelism, I'm doing lots of street evangelism, going door to door, banding with other men and hitting the road and following in the footsteps of St. Francis. And we're taking the gospel, doing apostolic evangelism, walking town to town with just a backpack on our back and sleeping in church pews. And
what?
And yeah, we're doing missions, New Testament style, into the countryside of Nebraska. Nebraska is uniquely positioned for this. There are little towns about 10 miles apart along dusty roads. And so we, as I said, local folks cared for us. And we went door to door and did surveys and just found out, where are people at? And I tell you, men came alive. Men loved this sort of adventure, this opportunity to embrace their countryside and their people and get to know the spiritual barometer. I think once you realize where people are actually at, I think you develop a heart for wanting to talk more about the gospel, about the Lord. So I've done about 6 of those missions, one of which now within my Catholic world experience, but 5 of them were just with this church and gathering together a band of about 12 men and just walking it out. Okay. But the hero of that is St. Francis, and I have a feeling that St. Francis was praying for me. because I began to be more and more inquisitive as to how he went about it. And I read Sabater's book. You know, he was an evangelical, he was a Protestant, but he wrote a wonderful biography on his life. Of course, John Michael Talbot and his music playing in the background, you know, wanting to live more simply, Richard Foster and all that influence. I'm wanting to live the gospel in simplicity and purity and to follow Christ without a whole lot of baggage. And so this is where more of the Catholic heritage begins to come in. But the critical piece was October 2009, when a young student that I was mentoring took me out for coffee, and as usual I thought we'd talk about beauty or aesthetics or some philosophical topic, but he said, "John, just wanted to get your thoughts. I'm planning to enter the Catholic Church next Easter." I'm like, "What? Where did that come from? Are you kidding?" So immediately I start to marshal my apologetic resources. Okay, let me kind of set you straight on this. But in the process, because I really respected him, and he's a very thoughtful, prayerful young man, I said, "You know, what has convinced you to go this direction?" He said, "Well, I've been doing a lot of reading and research, and a book that I'd love you to read is by David Curry. You know, born fundamentalist, born again Catholic." And I thought, yeah, I'll read it. I want to know, where did you get this crazy idea? So that was a book similar to Basic Christianity that put together and helped me assemble my understanding of the Catholic faith and the wisdom of the Catholic faith and the fact that Christ truly did start a church, which I totally overlooked. And it resolved a lot of tensions as a church architect that I saw as I got involved at a fairly deep level working with churches. I saw all these anomalies, all these contradictions, particularly the authority issue, that troubled me deeply. I kept wondering, what am I going to pass on to my children? To say, you know, this is solid, this bag of theology, you can trust this. I thought, I don't know what I'm going to pass on. It really troubled me. Because I thought, you know, is all I'm going to have is like one-page statement of faith? Is that all Christ has left us with? That's all we've got to live this life? I thought, no, there's got to be more. So this answered it beautifully. And you know what else was significant? Because I look at dates and timing of things, but October 20th, 2009, Pope Benedict issued that invitation for Anglicans to come home. So on that very same day, it was like the blinders were coming down. And Marcus, it happened very rapidly. By November 11th, which is what we call Armistice Day, I wrote in my journal, I began to keep a separate journal to my daily Bible reading journal. Just wanted to log what I was feeling and reading. I said on Armistice Day, "Lord, I lay down my arms. I have to surrender. I mean, at this point in time, I'm convinced that you really did found a church. I need to build out. I have questions. I'm willing to listen, but I'm pretty convinced." Yeah. So it happened fairly rapidly, but it took a long time to enter because my dear wife was not on the same page. And I was like, "Lord, you can't do this. I love my wife. We have a wonderful, close relationship. I'm in my 50s, you know, my children, my church, I'm an elder. I mean, my job, I'm working with a staunchly evangelical church building company. I can't say I'm Catholic. What am I going to do?" So a lot changed, and there truly were, you know, sacrifices, but I count it all joy. You know, I felt, what a privilege that I would lie awake at night and my body was buzzing with excitement, like finding gold in a field. It's like, I can't believe it. This is unbelievable what God has done, and now history makes total sense.
You know, your description of grace all the way through really connects for me, because we know C.S. Lewis was about as close to becoming Catholic as you can imagine, but his Ulster background made it really tough.
Yeah.
You know, and you talked about yourself, that you came from a culture that just the whole idea of it was a part of your genes.
Yeah.
In a way, and then of course you marry into a family from the Wheaton environment, which is very evangelicalism, almost the same sense. So it's this issue of grace opening a heart and mind.
Yeah.
I mean, was that, as you look back, I mean, it's...
Absolutely. The grace, this love story of God, you know, this incredible love, And my experience in the Catholic Church has been, I've been bowled over by the number of references to love. I mean, I thought my evangelicalism, yeah, there was love. We understood the love of God, but I see love everywhere. It comes up in everything. It's like, we are absolutely, intoxicated with love in this church. Everything I read, the spirit of the liturgy by, Pope Benedict, there's love woven into everything, into our understanding of architecture and the arts and prayer and devotion. And it really has surprised me. But,
I was thinking about the architecture side of things. It's fascinating too when you think about church buildings. I mean, one might think, well, what's the theology got to do with it? Well, what do you put in front of a church? Where is the sacrament located?
Yes.
Where's the altar located?
Yeah.
Who decides?
Right.
What's the center of things? Where are the people? I mean, the theology makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. Well, the Lord said, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And so many of the non-Catholic Christian churches are somewhat just buildings. I mean, they could be a concert hut for what a lot of folks care. I mean, the building has so little value. It's almost like a MASH unit. But in our tradition, the church has real significance. And the presence of Christ is there. And the liturgy, the Mass, is a prayer. So, to me, that it's like, that makes total sense. My house truly is a house of prayer, but it's a celestial intersection. I mean, we are engaged with a work that involves heaven and earth in this building. This building is, wow, this is supernatural, what's going on in here. So the significance has meant a lot to me, because I think as humans, we're made for greater significance than saying, it's just a building. It's really the ministry that's more important. No, you can live life that way. You can do church that way. But I think to become fully alive, St. Irenaeus said that when, that man is fully alive when he captures the whole vision of God. And this vision of God, I want to see him. Roy Hession, Old Methodist, the Calvary Road, or To See Jesus. Those books, that book, To See Jesus, that we would see Jesus.
Yeah. That
is, again, woven through my life. I want people to see Christ as who he is. And I think we need visual aids helpful in that process, with a stained glass or an icon. These do truly help us,
Well, there was centuries when your average person couldn't even read, and the way
Absolutely.
they would hear the story
Absolutely.
is the pictures.
Right.
I mean, that was...
Right. Yeah, this is certainly the way I'm wired.
An Anglican coming in, you could say a little bit of almost everything Catholic. Somehow or other you would have experienced in Calvinism or in Methodism or your Anglicanism, different levels of it in there, except dealing with that Pope.
Yeah, well, and that could have been a question I could have thought, can I just stay Anglican? Can I just take all the sort of best bits, maybe even pray the rosary as an Anglican? But St. John Henry Newman kind of nailed that one, unfortunately, early on. Said, that doesn't work. So, I think St. Augustine answered that one early on in church history as well, that's right, we have a Pope, and this is the piece that's so important. And though many Anglicans will say, well, he's our Pope too, but not really, guys. I mean, is he truly in that position of leadership and authority?
Again, it's an issue of authority when it crosses areas that make you uncomfortable. Yeah. Are you willing to obey freely as a disciple? You talked about discipleship earlier.
Right.
In areas that aren't as comfortable.
I'll tell you what, I was sick of being the Pope. You know what I mean? as a non-Catholic Christian, I mean, I'm a fairly studious person, so I'm happy to read. But for the average guy, how do they be the Pope? I mean, how do they work out end times theology, Holy Spirit theology? All these different topics, and I was busy reading on the side continually. I loved it. But I couldn't keep up. I could not work out. As I said, I had my heroes in the Arminian tradition and my heroes in the Calvinistic tradition. But I wanted to put one down and go in one direction, be really solid. It's too big. I was happy to say, I'm happy to submit to the authority of the church. And even if there are areas I'm not fully comfortable with, I don't fully understand. I'll work it out later, you know. And
well, that really is the issue. When you have really faithful people here and
Yeah.
faithful people here, and they can't agree, how do I decide which side?
yeah,
And so the Lord said, well, I established a church
Right.
to help you understand the fullness
yes,
of the faith.
yeah.
John, thank you very, very
Thanks,
much for
Marcus.
joining us on the journey home
Oh,
and
it's a
sharing
privilege.
your story with us. And you too, thank you for joining us on this episode. And I continue to pray that John's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.